Condition 1. The United States must completely lift its naval blockade of Iranian ports. Condition 2. All frozen Iranian assets must be released immediately. Condition 3. All oil sanctions must be removed. Condition 4. All U.S. military operations against Iran on every front must cease entirely. Do you see the gap? Trump is negotiating about nuclear weapons. Iran is negotiating about the blockade, the money, the sanctions, and the military presence. These two governments are not actually negotiating with each other. They are performing for their domestic audiences. They are having two completely different conversations and calling it diplomacy. And a former senior U.S. diplomat, a man named Alan Ayer, who was on the actual American negotiating team for the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement, said on camera this week something that I think is one of the most honest assessments I've heard from anyone in the American foreign policy establishment. He said, and I'll quote him, "Trump can't escalate, because if he does, Iran will counter-escalate against Gulf energy infrastructure. And that is something he's not willing to accept. But even if he wanted to walk away, he can't. This isn't business. You can't declare bankruptcy and move on. That's not going to open the strait." Think about what he's saying. The most powerful military on earth, carrier strike groups, Tomahawk missiles, $22.9 billion in new Raytheon contracts signed last week just to restock the weapons they already burned through. The USS Abraham Lincoln has been floating in the Persian Gulf for 9 months. The crew is developing documented psychological breakdown. Senators are going on television saying this war isn't making America safer, and their own former diplomat is saying on record that the president is trapped. He cannot move forward, he cannot move backward. Now here's something that I think is even more revealing than Ayer's statement. On August 18th, Trump posted a map on Truth Social, his social media platform officially labeling the Strait of Hormuz as new U.S. territory. He wrote that the strait is, quote, open and operating normally, all mines cleared or detonated. He said the naval blockade is fully in effect. He said there are no negotiations happening or scheduled. This is a man asserting total dominance over a body of water. The same day that post went live, IRGC-linked Fars News reported that Iran had seized the tanker Amara, an Emirati-flagged vessel near Keshm Island in the Strait, for failing to follow the designated maritime route. And a second vessel, the Minoan Dignity, was struck by fire while transiting waters near Hormuz. One sailor was killed. Trump says the strait is open, all mines cleared, everything is fine. Iran seizes a tanker and kills a sailor on the same day. Someone is not telling the truth about who controls the Strait of Hormuz. And I think when you look at what Iran actually built during those 60 days of ceasefire, the answer becomes very uncomfortable for Washington. During the MOU pause period, while everyone was celebrating what they called a de-escalation, Iran was not resting. Not for a single day. IRGC commanders used those 60 days to dramatically increase missile and drone production. They expanded direct IRGC command authority over Iran's conventional military, consolidating the chain of command for wartime operations. They dispatched Quds Force advisors into Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon to coordinate multi-front battle scenarios with Hezbollah, the Houthi forces in Yemen, and Iraqi proxy militias. They pre-positioned weapon systems around the strait itself. Naval mines, shore-based anti-ship missiles, drone swarms. And here's what I find most strategically revealing. Iranian officials confirmed to the Wall Street Journal that the IRGC has completed planning for what I would call their asymmetric escalation package. This includes scenarios for cutting the undersea fiber optic cables on the floor of the Persian Gulf, the physical cables that carry a significant portion of global internet traffic. This includes activating Shia communities inside Kuwait and Bahrain to generate civil unrest from within behind the lines of U.S. allies. This includes modeled scenarios for direct ground operations into Kuwaiti territory if the situation escalates beyond a certain threshold. And this is the one that I think gets least attention. Iran appointed a man named Hossein Taib as commander of the besieged paramilitary force. Taib is the former head of IRGC intelligence. He is one of the most feared internal security figures in the Iranian state. His appointment to command the Basij means one thing with absolute clarity. The hardliners in Tehran are preparing to lock down the home front to suppress any domestic dissent so that the IRGC can fight outward on all fronts without looking over its shoulder. This is not a country that is losing. This is a country that used a ceasefire to get ready for the next phase. And I want you to hold that picture in your mind as we go deeper. Now, the United States is diplomatically trapped. Iran is militarily prepared. The strait is not open, regardless of what any map on Truth Social says. And here is the question that I keep coming back to. The question that I think is the most important question in contemporary geopolitics right now. Why are the Arab states mostly silent? Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait, the UAE, these are countries whose entire economic model depends on oil exports flowing through Hormuz. These are countries with everything to lose from a prolonged closure. And yet, they are not applying maximum diplomatic pressure on both sides to force a resolution. They are not leading a Gulf Cooperation Council emergency initiative. They are managing the situation quietly, issuing careful statements, trying not to get their hands dirty. Why? I'm going to answer that question. But first, I need to show you a document. Let me take you back to 1996. A document was published called A Clean Break, a New Strategy for Securing the Realm. It was commissioned specifically for Benjamin Netanyahu's first term as Prime Minister of Israel. The lead author was Richard Perle, who was at the time chairman of the Defense Policy Board in Washington. The other principal authors included Douglas Feith and a man named David Wurmser. I want you to remember that name, David Wurmser, because that name is going to appear again in a moment in a way that I think will make your jaw drop. Clean Break made 4 core arguments. First, abandon the Oslo peace process entirely. No more land for peace. Replace it with peace for peace, meaning Israel makes no territorial concessions to anyone, ever. Peace is extended only from a position of superior strength. Second, do not wait to be attacked. Destabilize hostile neighboring states Syria, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon through preemptive strikes and proxy warfare. Start with Iraq. Remove Saddam Hussein. Use that as the opening move in a multi-decade regional restructuring. Third, eliminate American leverage over Israel by ending direct U.S. financial aid. As long as America funds Israel, America can pressure Israel. Cut the funding dependency and you cut the leash. This process, by the way, was completed by 2007. And fourth, reframe the entire Middle East conflict as a clash of civilizations, Israel as the essential frontline defender of Western values against an existential Islamist threat. Make this framing so powerful, so embedded in American political culture, that abandoning Israel becomes politically equivalent to betraying Western civilization itself. Now I want you to fast forward exactly 30 years, 2026. David Wurmser, the same David Wurmser who helped write Clean Break for Netanyahu in 1996, co-authors a new strategic document. It's called Israel 2048, a blueprint for rising asymmetric geopolitical power. 30 years later, same author. And what does Israel 2048 say? It says, Israel should have the unilateral right to launch what it calls preventative wars. Not defensive wars, not reactive wars, preventative wars against any rival that might threaten Israeli regional dominance in the future. This includes Turkey. This includes Egypt. This includes Iran. without requiring Washington's approval, without being constrained by international law. It argues that Israeli defense technology should be integrated so deeply into the Pentagon's procurement chain through co-development of AI weapon systems, directed energy weapons like the iron beam laser, quantum technologies, that the American military becomes structurally dependent on Israeli innovation, making it politically and practically impossible for Congress to use arms embargoes as leverage over Israeli behavior. And it describes Gaza in language I found genuinely striking when I first read it, as a testing laboratory, a live environment for developing and validating surveillance technology, and autonomous weapon systems that will power Israeli geopolitical dominance through the middle of this century. 30 years, same author, same logic, same destination. The tactics evolved from proxy wars to technology integration, but the endpoint never changed. Now let me tell you what that endpoint requires. And I want to be very precise here, because this is where the analysis gets uncomfortable for people. Israel's documented strategic goal stated in Clean Break, reaffirmed in Israel 2048, is regional dominance from the Jordan River to the Euphrates, the Greater Israel Project. Before you dismiss that as conspiratorial language, I want to remind you that it is the language of the documents themselves. These are not my words. These are the words of the men who went on to run the American national security apparatus under George W. Bush. Now, who stands in the way of that goal? Not Iran alone. Iran is powerful, but Iran can be degraded through sustained military and economic pressure. The real structural obstacle, the thing that actually prevents the map from being redrawn, is the United States of America. Because America is the security guarantor of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE. As long as America's military umbrella is open over the Arab world, those states are protected. And as long as those states are protected, the Middle East cannot be unilaterally restructured by any single power. That umbrella is the lock on the door. So the logic, and this is cold game theory, nothing personal, nothing ideological, pure strategic calculation. The logic of the Greater Israel Project requires two things to happen. First, destroy Iran as a regional military power. Eliminate the only state with both the ideology and the capability to militarily resist Israeli expansion. Second, drain the United States militarily, financially, politically, in terms of its allies' confidence, until it is forced to withdraw from the region. When both happen simultaneously, here's what remains. Iran is destroyed. America has withdrawn. The Arab states have no security umbrella. China is focused on Taiwan. Russia is exhausted by Ukraine. And Israel, armed with the most sophisticated AI-powered surveillance technology on Earth, battle-tested in Gaza, so deeply integrated into the American defense industrial complex that it effectively cannot be sanctioned, is the last nation standing. Now, how do you drain the United States? You push it into wars it cannot win quickly. Wars where victory is declared but the situation doesn't resolve. You fracture its alliances. You exhaust its treasury. You break the confidence of its friends. And when domestic opinion turns against the war, as it always turns in long wars, the withdrawal becomes politically inevitable. And the South Korea situation is, I have to say, the most elegant proof of this mechanism that I have seen in my career studying geopolitics. Because what happened with South Korea last week is not just a bilateral dispute. It is a game theory problem. And when you see it clearly, it takes your breath away. On August 16th, Trump ordered the Pentagon to substantially reduce the Ulchi Freedom Shield exercises, the most important joint military drill that America conducts with South Korea every year. The exercise is designed specifically to rehearse the combined defense of the Korean Peninsula against North Korean aggression. Trump did this because South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung said, and I love this detail, he said no thanks to joining the anti-Iran coalition. Just like that, no thanks. Now here's what I want you to understand. And this is the game theory insight that almost nobody is presenting in mainstream coverage of this story. It does not matter which way South Korea answers. The squeeze was constructed so that Washington benefits from either response. If Seoul refuses to join the Iran war, which is what happened, Trump uses that refusal as justification to cut military exercises, saving enormous amounts of U.S. defense spending. He creates a pretext to pull American carrier groups from the Pacific to the Middle East, which he needed to do anyway because the USS Abraham Lincoln needed to be relieved. He creates financial leverage to pressure Seoul into accelerating its $350 billion investment commitment to American industry. One analyst described this as Trump trying to hit 3 targets with 1 arrow. And she was right. But now, think about the other branch. If Seoul had said yes, if South Korea had agreed to join the anti-Iran coalition, here is what that delivers. South Korea's world-class shipbuilding capacity gets integrated into the U.S. Israel military supply chain. South Korea's semiconductor technology, arguably the most strategically important manufacturing capability on Earth right now, gets locked into the Zionist 2.0 integrated defense framework that Israel 2048 describes. The war becomes more internationalized, more legitimized, the costs get shared more broadly. Another sophisticated ally gets bound into the structure. Both answers serve the plan. And that is not improvisation. Israel 2048 is explicit about this. The document calls for defense technology integration. So deep AI, directed energy, quantum systems, that the Pentagon becomes structurally dependent on the network that Israel anchors. South Korea's semiconductors and shipbuilding capacity are precisely what that integration doctrine needs. If Seoul says yes, the network gains its most strategically important technology partner outside of Israel itself. If Seoul says no, the withdrawal of American deterrence from the Pacific accelerates. And that withdrawal is exactly what the Greater Israel Project requires. And then there's a third layer to this, a layer that goes through Moscow and ends in Brussels. When Trump cuts the Olchi Freedom Shield exercises, who benefits immediately? Not just Seoul's domestic politics. The immediate strategic beneficiary is Kim Jong-un, because reduced American military pressure around the Korean peninsula means North Korea can more freely allocate its military resources elsewhere. And North Korea has already been sending troops to Ukraine, between 14,000 and 15,000 elite soldiers deployed to the Kursk front. Millions of artillery shells, specialized ballistic missile units to Voronezh, and Ukrainian President Zelensky is warning that Pyongyang is preparing to send an additional 30 to 50,000 soldiers. So follow this chain. Trump pressures South Korea, reduces military exercises, eases pressure on North Korea. North Korea sends more combat experienced troops to Europe to support Putin. Russia holds its lines in Ukraine more effectively. Ukraine cannot win without Europe doubling its defense commitment. European governments are forced to spend more, commit more, drain their own treasuries, exhaust their own political capital. And when Europe is exhausted supporting Ukraine, when the European public is tired and the European governments are broke, the NATO alliance begins to fracture from within. And a fractured NATO cannot project unified pressure on Israel, cannot coordinate a meaningful response to Middle Eastern adventurism, cannot serve as the kind of multilateral counterweight that Israel 2048 explicitly describes as an obstacle to its vision of Israeli regional supremacy. This is the butterfly effect of that one social media post about South Korea military exercises. And it is not accidental. Now, I said I would answer the question about Arab silence. And I want to be honest with you, this is the part of the analysis where I know I'm going to lose some people, because what I'm about to describe is not comfortable. But I think the evidence supports it, and I think you deserve to hear it. Many Arab governments are not fully independent actors on this question. They are managed actors. And the mechanism of management operates through two channels simultaneously. One is coercive, and one is what I would call the survival insurance package. On the coercive side, intelligence. Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence service, is extraordinarily sophisticated at the collection of compromising information on foreign leaders. Financial records from offshore accounts. Communications, the kind of material that ends political careers and triggers international prosecutions. Arab leaders who have accumulated personal wealth through corruption are acutely vulnerable to this kind of leverage. And when you are vulnerable to this kind of leverage, your foreign policy choices are not entirely your own. But here's the other channel, the one that I think is actually more important. Because pure blackmail is unstable, the person being blackmailed is always looking for an exit. What makes this system durable is that the network provides something valuable in return. It helps. It helps Arab leaders move their money to safety, offshore accounts, European real estate, assets held in jurisdictions that the leaders themselves don't control, but that the network can access. It ensures that their children are studying at universities in London, Geneva, New York, safe, established, with the right connections for a comfortable life after their father's regime ends. It provides quiet security arrangements. It provides the infrastructure of a dignified exit. And in exchange for that survival insurance package, these leaders cooperate. They don't publicly oppose the anti-Iran campaign. They don't lead meaningful diplomatic efforts to stop a war that is economically devastating their region. They facilitate quietly. They issue careful statements. They manage the situation in ways that serve the long-term restructuring of the Middle East without appearing to do so. And this is precisely why the false flag operations are so important to the mechanism. On August 17th, a drone attack hit the offices of the Kurdish regional government in Erbil, in northern Iraq. Iran immediately denied responsibility and called it a false flag, a staged incident designed by the United States and Israel to poison Arab opinion against Tehran. The next day, August 18th, the UAE claimed that Iran fired 2 ballistic missiles toward its territorial waters, one falling outside, one falling inside. Iran denied that too. The Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman called it baseless and cited, and this is his exact language, the existing complexities caused by the continued mischief of America and the Zionist regime, and especially the record of numerous false flag operations in the region. Now look, I'm not telling you Iran's denials are accurate. I genuinely don't know whether those specific incidents were staged or real. That's a separate empirical question that requires access to intelligence I don't have. What I am asking you to observe is the function of these events, regardless of their origin. Every alleged Iranian attack on Arab territory, every incident that generates alarm in Gulf capitals gives Arab leaders a domestic justification for moving closer to the anti-Iran coalition. It gives them cover. It makes their cooperation look defensive rather than transactional. It makes the betrayal of their region look like self-defense. And every Arab state that burns its bridge with Iran, as the UAE did on August 18th, suspending all trade and financial transactions with Tehran, is one more state that will have no one to turn to when America finally leaves. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Professor, this is an extraordinary claim. You're attributing extraordinary coordination and foresight to a relatively small number of actors. Isn't that just conspiratorial thinking dressed up in academic language? And I want to take that objection seriously, because it is a fair objection. The counter-argument goes like this. Israel doesn't control American foreign policy. The 2026 war was driven by Trump's domestic political needs, by Netanyahu's corruption trial that conveniently disappears during wartime, by IRGC commanders who miscalculated and thought American resolve would collapse quickly. The same mistake that Hussein made, the same mistake that Gaddafi made. History is chaotic. There are no chess masters, Only human beings making imperfect decisions in real time. That's a serious argument, and I respect it. But here is the evidence I want you to weigh against it. Richard Perle, who wrote Clean Break for Netanyahu in 1996 and called specifically for the removal of Saddam Hussein, became chairman of the Defense Policy Board under George W. Bush and was one of the primary intellectual architects of the 2003 Iraq invasion. The first domino on Clean Break's roadmap. Completed by the document's own authors, Douglas Feith, another Clean Break author, became Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under Secretary Rumsfeld. He personally ran the Office of Special Plans, the intelligence unit that selected, amplified, and presented the WMD evidence that gave the Iraq War its justification. David Wormser, who wrote Clean Break in 1996, and Israel, 2048 inches, 2026, served as Middle East advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney during the Iraq War period. The same man who wrote a strategic plan for an Israeli prime minister in 1996 were subsequently appointed to the senior American government positions that were required to execute that plan's first phase. That is not speculation. That is documented career history that you can verify on Wikipedia right now. And the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, an American foreign policy think tank, not a fringe organization, published analysis in 2026 noting that, and I'll quote this directly, American public opinion is increasingly questioning whether Israel manipulated or instrumentalized the United States into a war that does not serve American national interests. That is a mainstream American think tank using the word manipulated. I am not asking you to adopt the most extreme version of this thesis. I am asking you to hold this question open with intellectual honesty. If a group of people published a 30-year strategic plan in 1996, and the men who wrote that plan were appointed to the positions required to execute it, and the first phase was completed exactly as documented, and the second phase is unfolding right now, at what point does conspiracy theory become strategy that worked? That is the question. And I don't think there's a clean answer. I think you have to sit with the discomfort of that question. So what happens next? What should you actually be watching? Because I think the most useful thing I can do for you is give you signals, concrete, observable things that will tell you whether this analysis is correct. Watch for the next false flag incident in the Gulf. The pattern from August 17th and 18th will repeat. Watch for incidents that give Arab states a domestic justification to formally join the anti-Iran security coalition. Watch Bahrain, in particular a majority Shia country governed by a Sunni monarchy that sits directly across a narrow stretch of water from Iran. Watch Kuwait. Watch whether Saudi Arabia eventually makes a formal security request that permanently ties Riyadh to the U.S. Israeli military axis. Every Arab state that formally breaks with Tehran is one fewer state that can serve as a diplomatic bridge in the post-war settlement. And fewer diplomatic bridges means more leverage for the last nation standing. Watch Iran's asymmetric escalation, because it will not be conventional. When Iran moves, it will not be tank columns or fighter jets. Watch the Strait of Hormuz itself for more tanker seizures. But also, and this is the one that keeps serious analysts up at night, watch for disruptions to undersea internet infrastructure in the Gulf region. If those cables go dark, the disruption to global communications would be disproportionate to any military response the United States could justify. It is a weapon that costs Iran very little and costs the global economy enormously. And watch the internal indicators in Iran, specifically the Basij mobilization. When Hossein Taib's internal security apparatus is visibly deployed at scale, it means the leadership has decided the external offensive is coming, and they are locking down the home front first. Watch the Korean Peninsula. Wang Yi's 48-hour visit to Seoul, which happened within 2 days of Trump publicly humiliating South Korea, over the military exercise cuts, was a strategic move of considerable elegance. China is offering Seoul exactly what Washington is withdrawing: reliability, stability, and a partnership that is not transactional. Watch whether South Korea's government begins making technology concessions to Beijing. Watch whether the South Korean legislature advances the debate on independent nuclear deterrence. And simultaneously, watch North Korean troop movements toward Europe. Because if Pyongyang sends the additional forces that Zelensky is warning about, you will know that the Korean butterfly has flapped its wings and the European storm is beginning to build. Watch the first formal Arab capitulation. Watch for the moment when a Gulf state officially joins the anti-Iran coalition, not quietly, but on the record, publicly. That moment will be preceded by a provocation real or staged that gives the government political cover at home. The provocation will be framed as self-defense. Watch for it, because that moment will tell you how far down the road of managed Arab compliance the network has actually progressed. Watch the American anti-war factor. Major Jason Watson, an active duty United States Air Force officer, was arrested in July for publicly protesting Trump's Iran war. He appeared on CNN last week and said he was prepared to accept military punishment. When serving officers go public against their own government's war, you are watching an institution begin to fracture from within. Senator Chuck Schumer called the Iran Memorandum of Understanding one of the greatest foreign policy fiascos in American history. Senator Chris Van Hollen said publicly that this war is not making America safer. These are not fringe voices. Watch for the first senior Republican, a senator with a real constituency, not a lame duck to break publicly with Trump over Iran. That is the threshold event. When it comes, the domestic political math for withdrawal becomes viable. And that is when the endgame accelerates. And finally, watch the Ice Silk Road. Because while everyone is looking at the Strait of Hormuz, something genuinely historic is being constructed in the Arctic. A Chinese shipping company called Sea Legend has launched what it is calling the Ice Silk Road, a new maritime trade route from Ningbo, China, through the Bering Strait, along Russia's northern sea route through the Arctic down to the United Kingdom. The transit time is 18 to 21 days. That is half the time of the Suez Canal route. And the entire route passes through waters that are outside the reach of American naval interdiction. India, South Korea, the UAE, Southeast Asian nations, Russia's Far East Development Minister announced last week that interest in the Northern Sea Route is growing rapidly among all of them. Now think about what this means strategically. The petrodollar system, the arrangement that makes the US dollar the world's reserve currency, is built on the fact that global energy trade is denominated in dollars and flows through maritime choke points that America controls. If energy trade begins flowing through an Arctic corridor that America cannot interdict, through financial systems being built by the Krink axis, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea using yuan-denominated transactions, and central bank digital currencies designed to bypass SWIFT, then the structural foundation of American financial power begins to experience pressure. Not overnight, not this year, but directionally. And direction is everything in geopolitics, because when the direction changes, empires don't fall in a day. They drift. They overextend. They spend $22.9 billion restocking missiles. They fight wars they cannot win quickly and cannot exit gracefully. They lose the confidence of allies who spend decades believing in their reliability. And then, one day, not with a bang, and not even necessarily with a formal announcement, they come home. They leave a vacuum. And the piece that nobody was watching moves into that vacuum and reshapes the world. Look, I want to close with something honest. I've been studying geopolitics for a long time. I've sat in rooms with people who make these decisions, and I've read the documents they write for each other. And the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing that I think is genuinely important for all of you to understand, is that the most consequential events in history are rarely the ones that the news cycle is tracking. The most consequential events are the ones happening off to the side, in the silence, while everyone's attention is pointed somewhere.